We are in verse 1 of 1 Thessalonians 1. Someone jokingly last week said we got through 3 words, and, well, not really. We got through 1 word. We skipped the second word. The second word is and. I didn't really think there was a lot of comments that we needed to make about and. It is a conjunction that joins 2 things together. So there we covered the second word a little bit more. But we were talking about Silas or Silvanus. So Sylvan is we mentioned the Roman name, means God of the woods, or Silas would be the Greek name. He was Paul's primary associate during the second missionary journey. If we turn back over to Acts, the 15th chapter, and that chapter deals with what we refer to as the Jerusalem Conference. It is a conference which took place, and I use the word conference very accommodatively there. It's not like the conferences that the Nicene Council and those things took place, but it was a gathering of some of those who were leaders of the church going to Jerusalem to talk to them about these individuals who came from Jerusalem who were false teachers. Yes? I didn't get the verse yet. If you want to skip down, it is verse 39 we'll start with. But after this conference, they made a decision to send letters from Jerusalem stating that those people were false teachers. You do not have to keep the law of Moses. You do not have to be circumcised. And then gave 4 things which they thought were needed. After that, Paul goes to Barnabas and basically tells him, let's go back and revisit all these congregations we began on the first journey. Barnabas said, that's a good idea, let's go. But we're going to take John Mark. And Paul said, no, we're not going to take John Mark. He left the work before. And so they got into an argument that was so contentious, so sharp, that they decided to separate one from the other. And down in verse 39, it talks about that contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from another. So Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So Paul has taken Silas, who becomes his main worker during that second journey. He was, as we go into chapter 16, Paul and Silas finally make their way to Philippi. And at Philippi, they were imprisoned. And as a result of that, Paul calls upon his Roman citizenship to basically scare the leaders half to death, but also to make them come and get him out of the prison to show they have done nothing wrong. because by arresting them and having them beaten as they had, and Paul being a Roman citizen, he could have been put to death for it, or those leaders. So I think so. Paul appealed to the Roman laws. You violated the Roman laws by doing these things. You now come and you make it right by you bringing us out of the prison. It shows that we did nothing wrong and that you were the ones in the wrong. Now then, they did it because all he had to do was appeal to Rome, and they would have been put to death. They would have been executed for what they had done. So Paul oftentimes used for lack of a better phraseology for us, the legal system that he had available to him to accomplish his purposes. And on this occasion, they've beaten us openly. They were saying basically we did wrong, putting us in prison. Now then, you come and bring us out. Don't just dismiss us and say you can go. That's not good enough. Why? Because everyone saw the public beating. Everyone saw them being thrown in prison. Now then, you do the same thing openly. Why? Because their character had been impugned. And it would have hindered the work which they were involved in preaching the gospel. So he called upon the Roman laws. And sure enough, here comes the leaders of Philippi to bring them out. Now, they did invite them to leave, but desired them to depart out of the city. And in a sense, basically when they were saying, we want you to leave, we would desire you to depart out of the city, in a sense, Paul says, when I'm good and ready, I'll go. Now, that's putting it in language that we would understand. That's not the way he worded it. But when he comes out of prison, if you look at the last verse of chapter 16, it says, and entered into the house of Lydia. He didn't leave. He went to Lydia's house. And when they had seen the brethren, he wasn't leaving until he decided to leave. They comforted them, and then they departed. Basically, it's we'll leave, but we'll leave on our own terms and when we're good and ready. I'll mention one of I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and some of them are First Amendment audits. Basically, will people and companies respect our First Amendment rights? And a lot of them don't, and call the police on them. And they invariably make the police leave first before they leave. Basically saying, we're not going to make it appear as if the police ran us off because we have done nothing wrong, and thus, after the police leave, then we'll leave. That's kind of what Paul was saying. We'll leave, yes, but on our terms, not on your terms. You're right. In Acts 23, before the Sanhedrin, Sergius Paulus had brought him to the Sanhedrin to try and find out what's going on, because he didn't know. And when he started to interrogate Paul, well, that interrogation was beating him until he confessed something. And Paul said, "Is it lawful for you to bind someone who's a Roman and uncondemned?" And all of those Roman soldiers, they left. They got out of there quick. And so Sergius Paulus was left. I don't know what's going on. I'll take him down to the Sanhedrin. Paul, knowing the Sanhedrin, knowing parts were Sadducees, parts were Pharisees. And you have to understand the nature of the Sanhedrin and the people at that time. The majority of people were Pharisees. The leading ruling group, you might say, would have been Sadducees. So on the Sanhedrin, you had a combination of both Sadducees and Pharisees. They had a running controversy as to the resurrection, angels, things like unto that. And so Paul says, the only reason I'm here is for the hope of the resurrection. And so the Pharisees almost admit, there's nothing wrong with this man. And the Sadducees say, that's wrong, he's wrong. And so they get into an argument, and they're about to kill Paul themselves in fighting between him. And so here comes Sergius Paulus and has to rescue him again. Still no further along than he was to begin with. But you're right, Paul used the rules of the synagogue in that sense. His knowledge of the, not the synagogue, the Sanhedrin, to basically get out of that situation. That's what he would do. It's not wrong to use the legal system in a right way. But Silas, going back to Philippi and their imprisonment, both Paul and Silas were there, and both of them in prison. And if you look at chapter 16 of Acts and verse 25, it tells that at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. So here's the two of them praying and singing praises. When we come into chapter 17 then, we have, well, they've left Philippi. They passed through, it says, verse 1, Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica, which is where we are studying, the town that we're talking about, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ. And some of them believed, and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of chief women not a few. Silas was there with Paul during that preaching at Thessalonica. We also find, though, that Silas had ties with Peter. If you turn over to 1 Peter 5 and verse 12. So he worked with Paul, but 1 Peter 5:12 says that Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose I have written briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God wherein ye stand. And so Silas, this being written by Peter, had certain ties with Peter, even though he worked with Paul. The third individual mentioned is Timotheus. Timothy is the anglicized form, and thus we generally use the term Timothy and not Timotheus. He is half Greek and half Jew from Iconium. He was what we many times use in a derogatory sense, he was a half-breed. Being a half-breed back then caused a great deal more hatred than it would now. The racism today is nothing compared to what it was in the time of Christ. The Jews hated these half-breeds, despised them. Now, to give you an example, they became the Samaritans. When a Jew would, traveling from southern Canaan to northern Canaan, he got to the land of Samaria, he would cross over the river Jordan, go up on what's called Transjordan, till he passed the land of Samaria and then crossed back over the Jordan. Why? Because he didn't want to contaminate himself with Samaritans. Didn't even want to be in the land. So that gives you a little bit of the attitude of the Jews during that time. Timothy, he was a half Jew, half Gentile. The Gentiles would reject the Jews as much as the Jews rejected the Gentiles. It wasn't racism one way. It was both ways. They were both bigoted. That's when one of the purposes, you remember the great famine that was going to come about, that they were prophesying of, and that then Paul started collecting money for the poor saints at Jerusalem. One of the purposes of that was not simply to relieve their physical affliction. It was to try to bring together Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians and bring them together. Look at how many times, read the book of Ephesians if you start in chapter 2 and see how he talks about the Jew and Gentile both in one body. And he's reconciled them both unto God. Both who? Both Jew and Gentile. When the gospel was first taken to the Gentiles, what happened? Peter comes home back to Jerusalem. Why were you there? Did you go there? And he was challenged by members of the church. And after Peter rehearsed all that took place, they had to admit, well then, God granted to the Gentiles the opportunity to believe and be saved too. So you have in Timothy both Jew and Gentile. Father a Gentile, mother a a Jew. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. All of these that we're talking about nationalities, we saw it from a color standpoint back in the, a century ago, maybe a little bit more than a century ago in the United States. And sadly, even some of those feelings even continued. I think they're pretty much gone with now, but there were congregations literally that would not allow black people to come in. Shameful. They sinned, but that was the attitude, and these were members of the church. Again, wrong and sinful. Just like, Russians and Latvians, they had to find a way to harmonize. Jew and Gentile. Paul's collecting money for poor saints at Jerusalem by Gentile Christians. One of the purposes, not just to relieve the poverty, but to show and to bring these two peoples together as being one. Bigotry is not anything new. It's been around since time began almost. In Acts 16 and verse 1, oh, by the way, his name, Timothy, means honored by God, or God honored. In Acts 16, verse 1, it says concerning Paul that he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman which was a Jewish, and believed, but his father was a Greek. Would you take this as you look at that his father was a member of the Lord's church? No, he wasn't. He was a Greek, but he was not a believer. It specifically identifies his mother being a Jew. She was a believer, so she was a Christian. It appears as if Paul converts Timothy, and then, well, let me go back a little bit. Paul, being raised by his mother and grandmother, he was raised in the Scriptures. If she is a member of the church, she believed, what Scriptures is she going to be teaching her son? Just the Old Testament? I think it would certainly include the Old Testament, but how could we exclude New Testament Scriptures? Even though they were not written down and codified at that time, still those New Testament Scriptures were being set forth by the priests or by the prophets and apostles. They were known to people. And so she would have been teaching him the Scriptures, both Old Testament, yes, and probably primarily Old Testament, but also New Testament. It would be, wouldn't it be inconsistent with her being a believer to say she didn't teach him what they were teaching in the New Testament principles, what we find written down for us in the New Testament, written down after the fact. But at that time, the prophets, the apostles, teaching. Remember the church in Acts 2. They continued steadfastly in what? The apostles' doctrine. Now, could we say that they continued in what we now have as the New Testament? Wouldn't that be a fair statement, at least? If it is, then why would it be inconceivable that Timothy's mother, who is a believer, is not teaching him those things as well, those scriptures, even though they were not at that time written down? She would have been going to a congregation there, yes. There would have been teaching along New Testament lines from that standpoint. The point I'm trying to get to is there's those who teach that the only scriptures that were available were the Old Testament scriptures, and thus he only knew and was only being taught by his mother Old Testament scriptures. And that's not a conclusion that really is demanded by the evidence that we have. She was a believer. She would have been a member of the Lord's church. She would have been teaching him those things that the apostles and prophets were teaching. Does that exclude Old Testament scriptures? Absolutely not. They would be included. Okay, Dale. They would have been teaching things that, yes, here's the prophecies of the Old Testament that demand that Jesus be crucified, that he died for our sins, that he was raised, that...
I mean, they could have read Isaiah 35, 5 and 6 about the 4 or 5 listed miracles and compare what Jesus did.
But there was also the prophecies, or they speaking forth for God as far as the New Testament church is concerned. And so they would have had that information. That information was later written down, what we now have as the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, but at that time they were stated by verbally, orally. Same scriptures, though.
They would have had people like Philip.
And they went everywhere preaching the word. Acts 8 and verse 4. So when you hear someone try to limit the scriptures, and I've seen arguments by some individuals who say that, try to basically do away with the New Testament, that the scriptures only refer to the Old Testament. Well, no, it doesn't. It also refers to the New Testament. And what Peter said in St. Peter, the 3rd chapter, that Paul was writing scripture. That should settle it for us. But the perfect law of liberty, a law which gives liberty or freedom from sin. Timothy was held in high regard by the church, and we see that in Acts 16 and verse 2, was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. And so in verse 3, him would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Here is a great illustration of expediency. Paul knew that everyone in that area knew that his father was a Greek, therefore he was not circumcised. So what did Paul do? So that he could work with those people and they would accept him, Paul took him and circumcised him. We see on another occasion with Titus, though, they tried to force Paul to have Titus circumcised, because they said in order to be saved, he has to be circumcised. Paul steadfastly refused to have him circumcised. Was it a matter of option at that time? Had to be, since he circumcised Timothy. Had to be a matter of option. For Timothy and the work that he's going to be doing, it was expedient for Paul to circumcise him. When someone tried to bind it, though, and say they have to be circumcised, Paul steadfastly refused to do it and to submit to their false doctrine. So, this was... Right, Timothy was for the work that he would be involved in and who he would be working with. Paul knew that he would have no influence with the people in that area, the Jews in particular in that area, because he was not circumcised. And so, to overcome that obstacle, Paul circumcised him. If they had demanded circumcision on his part, Paul would have refused that as well. No. The reason that Paul refused to circumcise Titus, though, was because of the false teachers, the Judaizing teachers who said for them to be saved, they have to be circumcised. Now, Titus, not being half Jew like Paul or like Timothy, would not have the obstacle that Timothy had to overcome in being a half-breed. But trying to make it a command that you, in order to go to heaven, the Gentiles had to be circumcised. And that's the situation with Titus. That's what they were saying. And so Paul says, absolutely not. I'm not going to circumcise him. Refuses to. But it was because of their false doctrine. With Timothy, it was purely an expedient matter to allow him to be able to work and have influence with people of that area. Okay.
Well, Paul said in Galatians 5:2, "So now Paul say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whoever of you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace."
That is dealing with being justified by the law of Moses. It was being circumcised to keep the law of Moses. In Timothy's situation, it was not being done to bring about justification by the law. It was not being done in obedience to the law of Moses. They were trying to force that upon Titus, and that's why he refused. So obviously, though, we see that Titus was held in high regard by the church, and he went with Paul at this time on that second missionary journey, and basically continued with Paul until Paul's death. In Romans 16 and verse 21, Paul refers to Timotheus, my work fellow. And so he identifies Timothy as a work fellow. We see in 2 Timothy 1, it identifies Timothy as having an unfeigned faith. Now the end of the commandment is, 1 Timothy 1 and verse 5, now the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart and of good conscience and of faith unfeigned. Timothy, from the things that we read about him in various letters, probably had a shy disposition. Paul, you could say he was the opposite of that. If something was going on, Paul, his nature would have been, I want to be in the middle of it. I remember our Rice said that years ago, that if something's going on, I want to be in the middle of it. And he was. But that's a lot like Paul's disposition. Timothy, on the other hand, would have been shy. He would have been the person, you go into a room and you never notice. That's kind of like what Timothy would be like. One thing about that, doesn't matter what someone's disposition is, whether they are, or personality is, they might be what we refer to as a type A personality. I guess there's a B and C and D. You only hear about type A personalities, but they're going to be out there. They're going to be out in the front. God can use that individual. Someone who's shy, the opposite of the type A personality, God can use that individual too. Doesn't matter one's personality, they can always use that and that nature that they have to bring about glory to God. Timothy, as we see here, has just recently returned to Paul from a trip to Thessalonica. Paul had basically sent him there to hear about the news of Thessalonica and what was going on. If you turn to 1 Thessalonians 3, in verse 1, he begins, wherefore when we could no longer forbear, we thought it good to be left at Athens alone, and sent Timotheus, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel, to establish you and to comfort you concerning your faith. So Paul sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. The congregation has been started. As we pointed out at times, they are suffering greatly. And so Paul sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to establish them, to encourage them, especially during that time of persecution. If you skip down in chapter 3 to verse 6, Timothy has now returned from that trip. And it says, "But now when Timotheus came from you unto us, and brought us good tidings of your faith and charity, which ye have good remembrance of us always, desiring greatly to see us, as we also to see you." So Paul sends him because he's concerned about these new Christians and the persecution that they're facing, knowing that that might cause them to turn away from the truth and to return into to idolatry. And so Paul sends Timothy to them. Now then, Timothy returns. And he gives them a great report. The brethren are good. They're remaining steadfast. They want to see you. They have a love for you. And so Paul's elated over this news, basically. But this book is written just after Timothy's return. It is written to the church of the Thessalonians. Dale, was that for a question or just stretching? Okay. Before we get, because our time's about up, I'm not going to get into the establishment of the church at Thessalonica. I want to add this. The church of the Thessalonians, we could call it the Thessalonian church. Thessalonians church. We ever want to give recognition to the fact, and I'll probably mention this more in detail next week, to the fact that Christ is the owner of the church, He's the head of the church, and all of those aspects concerning the church. Can it rightfully be said that the church belongs to us? In a sense, now understand, in a sense. For example, let me give you an illustration. The Cowboys are my team. How many of you believe by my saying that I own the Cowboys? Come on, surely some of you do. What do I mean? What do I mean by that? I have a vested interest in the Cowboys. I read about them. I keep up with them. I watch all of their games. I have a vested interest in the Cowboys. When it talks about the church of the Thessalonians, it's not talking about ownership. It's talking about these Thessalonians have a vested interest in the church, with the recognition that Christ is the owner of it. He purchased it. He's the head of it. And all of those details we need to understand. We'll stop there.